Okay, it says we're recording.
Okay, good, good, thank you. And then I'll talk with you later about how we can process that. I do believe that I'm still the presenter here, so I'll give that to you in a minute. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Julia Freeland is with us, and as you can see from the slide, she's from the Clayton Christian Institute. And she is the 8th person in our sequence of presentations about competency-based education. And as I was indicating in kind of our pre-call here, or pre-conversation, one of the things I'm noticing is that there are a lot of different ways to get to the end goal. And certainly one of the tools that is very common people are finding is, really helps to kind of make this work more seamlessly for students and teachers alike is blended learning. So that is kind of where we're going to head this morning. But before we do, I want to just, introduce myself. I'm Marcia Miles, President and CEO of EdTech Specialists. We are one of the sponsors of these series, and we are proud to have the lineup that we've had and appreciate every person who has contributed to the conversations that we've had. All of the presentations are recorded and archived, and they are on the EdTech website, so you can go back and view them anytime. We do have districts who are building professional development around these presentations, which is very exciting because that means, you kind of elevate the conversation throughout the state of Michigan and beyond that too, of course. The other sponsors that I want to recognize today are My Virtual Academy. They partner with districts throughout Michigan and create virtual learning for students in these areas. Michigan Virtual, and they're always very supportive of our work, and they play a large role in what we do here in Michigan for the virtual learning piece and the blended learning piece. And then ThinkSpace, and that is a new conference center in Lansing, and they've been extremely helpful to really help get the word out for us. And so if you've got anything going on in Lansing, really check out ThinkSpace because it's a very intimate setting, very creative. One of the owners is, he still is with Apple, and he's an Apple person, Apple thinker. So what he's created is kind of that, a different way of holding conversations together. So I would encourage you to, support our supporters. We appreciate them very much. The other thing is that I want to just kind of remind everybody about the other webinars coming up. We've got 2 more in the series on October 20th. The Virtual Learning School in New Hampshire, the director of that program is going to be with us. And then on November 3rd will be Michael Horn, who is also with the Clayton Christian Institute. And Julia was telling me that really the sequence of all of these has been really interesting because I lined them up not really having a sequence in mind, but it's worked out beautifully. And Julia's coming before Michael's, and Michael's kind of wrapping up this first series. It's going to be perfect. It's all falling into place nicely. So the other thing I want to just remind you of is the ability to talk with Julia or to ask her questions in the chat. And you are wide open to do both. So I see that some of you have muted yourselves, which is great. But feel free to unmute yourself. And if you do that, just be aware that background noise, if you unmute yourself, is picked up as though there's a microphone in your hand. So please only unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question, or you can just go in the chat, and Julia will pause periodically and see if there are questions, or I'll jump in. So we've got lots of different ways that you can converse with Julia, but we have found in the past that really having that back and forth conversation, if you're comfortable with that and would like to do that, works out really, really well. So Julia, I'm about to hand over the presenter tool for you so that you can take it from here. And I'm going to thank you at the beginning and thank you at the end because I'm very excited to hear what you have to tell us. So let me just see here. Okay, good. I seem to have to do it twice to make you the presenter. Now, did that come up for you?
Great. Yes. Can everyone see my screen?
Thank you. Thank you.
Is my screen showing up?
Yes, it is.
Okay, awesome. Great. Thank you so much, Marcia. And thanks for the kind introduction. You know, we at the Christensen Institute, I think we think of Michigan, certainly through Michigan Virtual, as an early mover in the online learning space, but it's really exciting to see just over the past year how many sort of conversations, one-off conversations I've been able to have with folks in the state looking at competency-based education. And today, you know, it's sometimes a spoof of a think tank to sit around and talk about theoretical ideas and less about kind of rolling up your sleeves and doing the hard work that you guys do each day inside school systems. But what I want to do is kind of pull us back and talk about where the strands and sort of trends in competency-based education and blended learning overlap and where they're sometimes at odds. Because what I've observed over the past 2.5 years digging in, particularly in New Hampshire, which is obviously thought of as a sort of first mover in competency-based education, but across the nation, I've heard various ways in which there's some slippage between the ideas of competency-based education and blended learning, and where we're lacking clarity around where they can be symbiotic and where they sometimes actually are at odds. So that's kind of the theme of my talk today. As Marcia mentioned, early November, Michael Horn from my team is going to be presenting on blended learning, specifically sort of his book Blended that he wrote with our colleague Heather Staker on kind of an implementation design process. So he'll be sort of digging in on what we think of as the steps to build a new blended learning program and to sort of evaluate programs you have in place. Happy to answer questions on that front, but I just want you to keep in mind that that's coming in a few weeks or in a month or so. A little bit about the Christensen Institute for those who don't have background. We're a nonprofit think tank that was founded on the premise of Clayton Christensen's theory of disruptive innovation, which actually comes from the business world. And it describes how certain innovations sort of hit the market and topple incumbents in a given industry and really redefine what we think of as high performance in a space. And what happened was Michael Horn and Clay Christensen got together back in 2006 and wrote a book called Disrupting Class, which basically looked at how online learning was taking a disruptive trajectory in the education space. Now, though, we spend a lot of our time not talking about necessarily the growth of online learning, but the particular blended learning and competency-based models that are emerging in classrooms, in K-12 classrooms across the country. I have my contact information up here because, as Marcia said, please do interrupt me and just ask questions because we're a small enough group, but also get in touch after if there's any way that we can be of help or just to sort of inform us about what you're doing on the ground. Okay, so, whoops, there we go. So here's the sort of 4 questions I want to tackle today. A little bit on definitions, which I know the field can be sort of obsessive about, and we have definitions and we sort of keep talking about them ad nauseum, but I want to talk about how the definitions of competency-based and blended learning overlap. Then I want to talk about how blended learning can support competency-based education, and then the inverse. How can competency-based education actually support blended learning? And lastly, I think sometimes the blended conversation can be confusing because we're talking about all sorts of EdTech tools, and there's a very distinct kind of infrastructure play that I think is unfolding in this overlap of the two worlds that's worth highlighting and talking about. So this was like, we're at the frontier of my ability to make PowerPoint slides right here. I made this earlier this week, and I apologize for the rudimentary shapes. But I wanted to illustrate what I thought were 3 big ways that the field is talking about these 2 distinct things and how they either complement or work against one another. So the first bucket that probably many of you are living in your classrooms and school systems is just a pedagogical point, which is that blended learning as a delivery model can complement a competency-based progression, right? So if we're actually trying to have each individual student move on when they're ready, when they've demonstrated competency, blended learning is a way to effectuate that sort of flexible pacing by delivering content on an as-needed basis and assessing on demand, right? And that to me was a very clear overlap from the start in doing my research. Now, that doesn't mean, the reason I've illustrated this as a Venn diagram, it doesn't mean that all blended learning programs are competency-based by any stretch of the imagination, nor are all competency-based education programs taking advantage of technology. And you can definitely have a competency-based program that is tech-free, or that's just tech-rich, like students may be using computers, but you may not actually be delivering content online. Similarly, you can have students very much squarely in a seat time-based system, but that are exposed to blended learning models. And And so I think that's just one way to clarify that there's an overlap, but they can also function sort of exclusively on their own. The second chart I have up here on the top right is actually how we probably think about the relationship of competency-based and blended here at the Christensen Institute. And it's sort of a market analysis framing. So like I said, Michael Horn and Clay Christensen wrote the book Disrupting Class and illustrated that online learning was rapidly growing in K-12 education. And they posited that this could be, and I emphasize could, this could be a really good thing for students if online learning grew in a student-centered way. In other words, if we use technology to actually differentiate it to a degree and with precision that was never before possible, even for amazing teachers who had great instincts and skill sets around differentiated instruction. It simply was not possible to do at scale, as many of us know, in a classroom with 30 kids. The question, though, is that online learning could also grow in a way that is not at all revolutionary and that simply digitizes our existing seat time-based system. And we've seen that happen in some states, and I think it's actually where you have where the skeptics of sort of online blended digital learning have a real case to make, right? Like if we're just putting students in front of computers and delivering content much in the way that a traditional lecture looks, and we're not leveraging technology to personalize, that's actually not particularly revolutionary or interesting. And so where competency-based, particularly policy and sort of philosophy comes in, is that it sets the conditions for online learning to grow in a way that is far more personalized and that actually really does break that traditional factory mold. So in that sense, online learning, again, like the first example, it's a delivery mechanism. It's growing because the market is turning to it as an affordable solution. But competency-based education policy hopefully sets the market conditions that happens in a way that's good for kids. The last piece here is sort of a less optimistic look at where the field is headed, but I have had a number of conversations in the past year that make me think that this is a real possibility. And that's that online learning advocates and providers see themselves somewhat at odds with competency-based education advocates and vice versa. And I think that we can trace this to the historical trends of these two movements, so to speak. So competency-based education predated online learning for obvious reasons, right? Like the technology simply wasn't in place until about 20 or 10 years ago to even deliver online learning in the way that we're seeing now. Competency-based education, on the other hand, the concept started to pop up. Well, let's be real. It popped up initially with sort of the tutorial model that's been around forever, right? Because in a one-to-one tutoring situation, you're really only advancing when you're ready, and there's no incentive to have you do otherwise. But competency-based education as a term and a sort of concept in education and curricular reform emerged in the middle of the 20th century in teacher education programs. And the goal there was really very much a curricular reform. It wasn't so much focused on a pacing reform, but the emphasis was on how can teachers who are preparing to enter the classroom, how can we ensure that they can show what they know and that they can really actively do what we think they need to be able to do, right? And that's, Marcia was mentioning before we started this morning that we're hearing a lot in higher ed around competency-based education. The way that that term is being used in higher ed, much like it was being used in the middle of the 20th century, is really around what are your skills that you can apply in the workplace, right? That's sort of the movement in higher ed. And that emphasis on doing and demonstrating what you know was really at the heart of competency-based reform at the beginning. Not surprising then that many folks now sitting around the competency-based table in K-12 are incredibly focused on assessment reform, performance assessment, and deeper learning. Now, those are all really important facets, I think, of a well-functioning personalized system, but you can imagine that the way online learning has grown up is actually very different. So early online learning was almost exclusively about access, right? It wasn't reinventing teaching and learning as we know it. It was delivering learning to students who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. And that was in the form of credit recovery programs and early learning labs. That was in the form of AP online courses. at rural and urban schools that otherwise couldn't offer those courses. And that's really where online learning got its start, as an access play, not a curricular reform play. And so as blended learning has sort of grown up, there's certainly new sort of visions of what curriculum and teaching and learning look like in a blended setting. But the emphasis on deeper learning, on projects, on performance assessment is only sort of a recent part of that conversation. And so when you have people sitting around a table, and maybe they can even agree to the vision in that first bucket pedagogically, that blended learning could in theory support competency-based education, but there's a very different sort of philosophical DNA to these two movements that can make it feel like folks are talking past each other. The last thing I'd say there is that online learning, after sort of the initial access play, it really became about anytime, anywhere learning, right? And so the emphasis on flexible pacing for individual students has really been a big play in the online blended learning space. When I think certain competency-based advocates hear about flexible pacing, the fear is that we're just sort of churning students through a learning progression and never really going deep on topics, never sort of pulling out to do deeper inquiry or sort of interdisciplinary projects, which they feel is sort of near and dear to what true competency-based education is. So I know I spent a long time on this slide, but to me, this is like, as practitioners in the space, as advocates in the space, we have to be incredibly crisp about how these two are complementary and how the sort of camps, which are not mutually exclusive, but the two camps of competency-based and blended can sometimes work against each other. I also can't, can I see the chat? If you guys are asking questions, I'm not seeing them, so please do interrupt me. Okay, no questions. Okay, quickly, you guys are all probably familiar with this, so this is just some quick definition work. We use the Competency Works definition of competency-based learning. However, the thing I sort of caution folks against in the field is how hard this can be to apply in real-world settings. So I used this definition when I went into New Hampshire to dig in on what competency-based education looked like on the ground and how schools were using technology to sort of expand their competency-based education programs. And the tricky thing about this definition is that it's normative. It's describing a high-quality system. And it makes it really hard to then use as a filter for saying, yes, no, this system is competency-based. Because if we're being honest, like any education reform, you could have a low-quality competency-based system, right? Depending on how you define quality. And I think we need to be honest about that so that we can start to actually evaluate these programs in a meaningful way. The other thing to sort of highlight here, going back to my last point about blended learning and competency-based education sometimes being on slightly different pages, these first two kind of bullet points, I think, are very clearly what blended learning and sort of EdTech advocates are invested in, right? There's a level of differentiation and a flexibility in pacing that technology can effectuate. These last three, though, I think are where we actually see some fault lines in terms of where the emphasis on sort of assessment being meaningful, on interdisciplinary competencies can come out. So I just point that out also as a feature of this definition. The other way I framed this, and I think Dave from Fraser has heard me do this before, so sorry for the repetition, but is that actually competency-based education is three different things in the way that it's being used in the conversation right now, but people kind of don't acknowledge these categories. So competency-based education is a philosophy about what education should look like. It's a set of policies that are trying to do away with some of the time-based kind of calendar year policies in our K-12 system. And lastly, it's a bundle of practices. Now, people sort of assume that people are on the same page philosophically, because if you explain to anyone, even state legislators who know nothing about education, if you say to them, yeah, remember how when you were in class and like the students around you were either way far ahead and you were totally lost, or you were, sailing way further ahead than your fellow students, but you were held back because you had to move at a cohort pace. Everyone gets that. Everyone gets how irrational the sort of seat time system is. The problem is, philosophically, there's still some really tricky questions that the field hasn't worked out and that I think individual districts really need to be wrestling with as they implement competency-based programs. And one example I just have here is the question of, when we say advance upon mastery, does that mean to advance deeper into a certain subject matter or to continue further onto new topics? And a lot of systems, I think, want to have it both ways, or they want to give students choice in that, which I think is encouraging, but we need to just have clarity about what that learning progression looks like. Policy, similarly, I think that when I first joined the Christensen Institute 2.5 years ago, we would frame competency-based policy purely in terms of seat time in the Carnegie unit. So are schools required to report out on seat time, A, and B, are graduation requirements pinned to the credit hour? What I've found over the past 2 years is that in some ways we as a sort of movement, we're oversimplifying what competency-based education policy is. Because if you go back to that idea of a sort of entire philosophy of rethinking education, and many of you may be living this, obviously there's going to be other policies like teacher evaluation systems, federal accountability, that actually have constrained us and put us in a very time-based box. So even the states that have implemented seat time waivers or even gone so far as to get rid of the Carnegie unit, we're not necessarily seeing competency-based education flourish because we have all sorts of other interlocking policies in place that are still de facto pinned to the credit hour. So I think in Michigan, I'm less familiar with the sort of Michigan policies around this, but as you're talking to policymakers or thinking about a coherent policy vision, looking at every single policy and how time is sort of assumed into it, or how annual attendance is assumed into it, is going to be really important. And my latest thinking on this is that until we touch the funding formula, we're not really going to see major shifts at scale towards competency-based learning. When Steve Kozakowski presents in the coming weeks on VLAX's model, I'd encourage you guys to sort of have him dig in on their funding formula, which is essentially they get funded on the basis of students mastering concepts, irregardless of how long it takes. And I think that that's really the incentive structure that gets schools moving towards truly competency-based approaches. Lastly, competency-based education is a collection of practices. And what's confusing, as I'll show on my next slide, is that a well-run competency-based system is likely borrowing from a bunch of practices that predated this movement, right? There's sort of, maybe you're doing really rich project-based design, maybe you're using blended learning, maybe you're using sort of extended learning opportunities or internships outside the classroom to get interdisciplinary experiences or to allow students to show what they know outside traditional sort of pen and paper tests. And the problem then becomes when you're using all of these practices that we've sort of seen evolve over time, and then you bunch them together and you say this is competency-based, it's actually not a consistent way to describe a coherent model. And what I've pushed folks in the field to do, because we have neither the time nor funding to do this, but is to start to try and codify different models that all fall under competency-based. And I think that actually will be another piece that will lend all of this to scale in a way that right now we're building the plane as we fly it and using a bunch of different practices that have been around for a long time and calling them all competency-based. So here's a list of some of those practices, right? And these probably look familiar to those who have been spending time implementing competency-based systems. And I'd encourage you to sort of like come up with like, what is your exact model? What have you deliberately chosen to do or not do on this list or on other lists of sort of practices? And can you think of other models in the nation that look similar? And can we start to codify around those? Now, obviously, you're seeing on this list, blended learning is one of many practices that's now falling under that competency-based bucket. So again, think back to that Venn diagram. Some competency-based models will invest in sort of a blended learning practice as part of a bundle of things that they're doing differently to deliver on this new philosophy. Real quick, this is our definition of blended learning. The one thing I do in all talks, regardless of the level of expertise, which I think is pretty high on this call and pretty high in Michigan because of the great work you guys have done for so many years. But what we like to differentiate here is that blended learning is about delivering content online and then using data to link that to what you do face-to-face offline. This is not doing collaboration on Google Docs or having students create blogs or do research on the internet. All of those are fine practices, but we would call those tech rich. in that they're not actually changing the delivery model of education. It's using technology to engage students in new ways. And that's just one distinction to make. And I actually think that many of the competency-based systems I've seen tend more towards tech-rich because they have a project-based bent, but aren't actually using coherent blended learning models to deliver content more efficiently. Smart boards, just to nail home the tech-rich concept, smart boards are not blended learning. One-to-one programs are not blended learning because we really want to think of blended learning as an instructional redesign rather than sort of a hardware play. Okay, so how can blended learning as this new delivery model, oh, I'm seeing a Dave question. Developing and sharing, successful students. Yes, okay, I agree with you, Dave. Always good to have the comment be affirming my point. Okay, so how can blended learning support competency-based learning? So this was sort of the question I went into New Hampshire asking. And those more familiar with New Hampshire than I was 2 years ago may know that there's two variables that make it a sort of tricky place to ask this particular question. One is that it's sort of historically a bit of a Luddite state. So it's not one of the early movers a la Michigan in the sort of online learning movement. They've had VLAX, Steve Kozakowski's organization, for a long time, but otherwise it's not been sort of on the one-to-one train or the sort of technology train for a long time. The other variable is that it's the live free or die state, which means that it's an incredibly intense local control political culture, and therefore what discrete school districts are doing is rarely shaped by the state's policy agenda. So those are just two factors to keep in mind as you hear about New Hampshire kind of in the competency-based news. It's a bit of a tricky animal to pin down because of those dynamics. But this was the question I asked. And so here's some like very basic concepts, right, of why technology and blended learning can help in a competency-based progression. One is just the idea of a continuum of learning, right? That as we try and move students on a flexible pace, if online content can be sort of the backbone of that, you can actually have students moving at their own pace in a much more organized way than if you're trying to do that in a purely face-to-face sort of textbook worksheet-driven world. The other is that testing can occur on demand. I think this is also like a real, at a practical level, at the practice level, this idea of assessment being flexible may be the fulcrum that some systems really latch onto and can adjust around, which is that students are tested when they are ready, and they are tested on an interim basis to measure whether they're ready individually, right? This isn't sitting down and doing the Friday spelling bee quiz. It's each student is sort of on his own assessment journey. New Hampshire, you'll hear, is making a lot of investment right now in assessments, but it's with less emphasis on an on-demand model and more emphasis on a performance assessment model. So they're really trying to redesign assessments themselves. They're not putting as much thought as I think they necessarily should into the sort of pacing and frequency and on-demand quality of those assessments for students. So that's just something to be aware of also in sort of the national conversation. The other thing that you can see, and this is actually what we're seeing grow up in the online competency-based higher ed programs that are getting a lot of attention right now, but online content, unlike face-to-face sort of lectures, can be delivered in a far more modular manner, which means that students can actually move through those modules with A, some degree of choice, and B, again, flexibility around pacing. This, for those who recognize it, it may be an out-of-date already image from Khan Academy's learning map, right? But just the idea that there's not one path to mastery. I think a lot of educators would agree with that even in an analog world, but that we can actually create a whole bunch of pathways using technology can really unlock that piece of a competency-based model. I think one thing that is sort of a tension in the space right now is that educators tend to want to define these discrete pathways themselves, and they're less enamored with software companies that have predetermined what those different pathways look like without being in consultation with their customers, right? And what we call that is the tension between adaptive versus assignable content. And it's something to be aware of as you're looking for vendors and software programs to support a competency-based model. How much do your teachers want to be able to step in and create those pathways themselves? And can you have an honest conversation with vendors about that? I think a lot of people sort of found that out too late with vendors in the space. And lastly, I think this is probably the most important point that my New Hampshire research revealed. Not that it's particularly novel, but that this is really about scale. Some of you may have heard of Kim Carter at MC Squared in New Hampshire. She's run a pretty amazing personalized competency-based model for a number of years in the state that really does break the mold. It looks a lot like sort of old school project-based learning, but with a lot of rigor and sort of deliberate organization around it. She is not using technology in an intensive way, but they have historically also been a pretty small school. And so the question is, when you look at a school like MC Squared, can blended learning scale some of the processes that they've put in place in an analog world, right? So it's not technology for technology's sake. It's not software sort of shooting content at kids at random, but it's a really deliberate model that's been built in a small setting that we're using blended learning to eventually scale. And this is a little plug for my latest research project. So although I've spent a lot of time on competency-based education in the EdTech market, I'm now looking at using technology to enhance students' access to social capital and new relationships. And I think this is a place where competency-based education, because of the emphasis on sort of real-world application, will be a space that moves faster than other fields or other sort of movements in ed reform. And that's just to say that we can use technology to actually expand students' access to experts beyond their classrooms. We're just not really doing that very frequently right now. So happy to talk offline about that. But that was my little thematic slide on social capital. Okay, this was the other question I sort of really posed in New Hampshire, right? Which is, are all models equally sort of set up to support competency-based progression? And the answer was pretty clearly no, but with a very small sample size. So this is a really admittedly ugly diagram, but I'll just walk you through what it's showing. And it's that what I found was when it came to the competency-based models that I found in New Hampshire, disproportionately what we would refer to as disruptive blended learning models were supporting those models, those competency-based models at scale. Whereas the blended learning models in New Hampshire that tended to be more time-based were what we would call sustaining blended learning models. So I'm going to walk through just the 3 or 4 types of models that we're seeing as more inclined towards a competency-based progression. And I think this is really important because if you are trying to create a competency-based progression and you look out at the world of blended learning and you say, oh, flipped classroom is in every single headline on K-12 blended learning, so we should use flipped classroom to do competency-based education. The fact of the matter is, flipped classroom is actually preserving a lot of time-based qualities in a traditional classroom and may not get you the kind of boost that you would hope a blended learning program would get you. So here are the couple of models that we find lend themselves to competency-based education. The flex model, and Michael Horn will talk through these in greater depth. The flex model has been popularized by Summit Public Schools out in California, but it's actually also the model that was used in some of the earliest credit recovery programs. And it essentially means that the backbone of learning is online, and then students are breaking out into small group instruction or group projects sort of on an as-needed basis. But the idea, again, going back to that idea of a single learning progression that technology can, or multiple learning progressions that a technology can allow, the sort of playlist option that some schools are going for really unlocks that potential for numerous models and flexible pacing along a single progression. The next one is the individual rotation model, sort of a close cousin to flex. But in a flex setting, when students come in, they can often choose what they want to work on. In an individual rotation model, you are handed an individualized schedule every day based on your performance the days and weeks prior. Obviously, inherent in the idea that each student has his or her own schedule is the fact that they are sort of moving at their own pace through a given curriculum or a set of learning pathways. Teach to One Math sort of popularized this approach, but there was a neat school way up in the North Country in New Hampshire called Milan Village that was doing this in really exciting ways. The a la carte model simply describes students going to brick and mortar schools and then taking one-off online courses. And this is where VLAX, the Virtual Learning Academy Charter School that Steve will be presenting on in a few weeks, is sort of the main provider of competency-based experiences in the state of New Hampshire. So Steve has reached incredible scale as a virtual learning provider for obvious reasons. The thing to point out here is that if your school system is sort of on the cusp of trying to give your students competency-based opportunities, but you don't have a ton of infrastructure in place to get that off the ground quite yet, you can sort of quickly expose students to competency-based learning by choosing the right a la carte provider. That obviously has pros and cons to it. I think that to get back to that sort of tension of where educators want to feel like they're creating the program versus outsourcing to a software provider, the other thing we're seeing some school systems do is teachers create online courses and then students can take those on a much more flexible pace. The other a la carte kind of movement afoot, particularly in New Hampshire, was around something called competency recovery, which was basically that VLACs broke their courses up into discrete modules that were aligned to statewide competencies. And teachers and students could sort of pick and choose those models based on areas that students had struggled to master. And so instead of having to retake an entire course, much like unit recovery, you would pull an individual module from VLACs and just do that to recover those credits. I have blogged about the fact that I think competency recovery is an oxymoron, right? Because in a truly competency-based system, you're not actually accruing those gaps that you have to go back and fill. But it's an interesting hybrid that New Hampshire has pursued that other states might think about as they transition to a fully competency-based model. And the last piece that you'll be learning about from Steve as well as an enriched virtual model, which is still full-time virtual courses, but with a brick and mortar location that students can come to collaborate on projects. But again, lends itself to students moving at their own pace through an online curriculum. Okay, so now I want to flip it, and I've already alluded to this, so this won't take long. I just want to flip it to think about the opposite direction. Rather than thinking of competency-based as a thing that blended learning can come in and potentially support as a practice, how can competency-based education actually support blended learning? And this is what I was alluding to in that first slide with my ugly charts, which was online learning is growing at an incredible rate right now. And I think sometimes, particularly Christensen Institute's work, but in general, the EdTech world is perceived as seeing this as unambiguously good for students. But any educators on the call know that this could actually spell trouble if we're doing this in an irresponsible way and if we're not actually keeping an eye on the quality of the learning experiences that are happening online or in a blended capacity, right? And so the reality still is that depending on the performance metrics that we set in policy, we will either use online learning to digitize the old system, or we will successfully use it to break the traditional mode. And obviously, this is where competency-based education policy can be an incredible aid to checking the online and blended marketplace, right? I think that this is also where excuse me, this is also where performance metrics can be really tricky because even with all the progress that we've made, I think in terms of emphasizing equity through federal policy still focuses on average proficiency across school systems. And until we're really homing in on individual mastery and school systems are incentivized to make sure each student is learning, we're not going to have the incentives in place for schools to really shift away from that average cohort-based model. So I think performance metrics aren't just about getting rid of seat time. They're about ensuring that schools are held accountable to individual student mastery, and then they will pivot their systems to actually accomplish that. Okay, and this is just the last piece that probably some of you have felt more pain around than anything I've talked about before this, and that's around infrastructure. So this is distinct. This is a distinct sort of technology play from blended learning. Remember, blended learning is about delivering content online and assessing students formatively on a more regular basis, using that data to shape what you do face-to-face. Infrastructure, on the other hand, is how the heck do we track student mastery in an organized, coherent way in this new non-seat time-based system? We know that historically, the SIS, the Student Information System, has been the albeit paltry source of truth for schools on both a reporting basis and a tracking basis. And the trouble is that SIS platforms were never designed to be a competency-based knowledge management or information tracking system. That was never the goal, but they've been kind of jerry-rigged into being that at a lot of school systems. Or they are sort of holding school systems back from being able to really track students in a granular and efficient manner. But as evidenced by the 8 out of 101 attendees on this call, this is an incredibly small market still. And so the movement we're seeing in the market, there's definitely some players coming out to fill this gap. But in my conversations with Paul Leather, for example, like he's been blown away by the fact that there haven't been more successful infrastructure plays. And I always remind him, like, Paul, you're the only state that's really trying to do this at scale, right? And so for an SIS or an LMS provider, like that's just not a compelling area to innovate. That said, we are seeing some movement. So let me go ahead on these slides and then I'll come back. So these are just a couple. You guys may be using other tools, but these are sort of these interesting hybrids of LMS systems, grading systems, portfolio management systems that have come out that we're seeing some of the kind of forward-thinking districts and school systems using. I think the trouble is, again, that because this marketplace is so small, what we're hearing a lot is that school systems want to do one-off design contracts with firms to create customized systems that match their exact needs. And what that means is that I think we're not seeing sort of solutions that will work at scale quite yet. I'm trying to watch this marketplace, but if you guys know of other providers that I should be adding to this list, which I already know there's some missing from this, do let me know. And I think that really it's a matter of folks at the cutting edge who are trying to implement, pooling their demand to get really good tools out there rather than trying to kind of, like I said, jerry-rig existing tools. The other piece that even those providers aren't solving for when it comes to building a blended and competency-based system is that even if we get some encouraging platform plays, the incentives in the market right now are such that platforms integrating with blended learning software providers is a messy and troubling process. And so you have people trying to step in like Clever and say, we'll hack into these APIs and make sure that you have a seamless sort of user interface for students who log on to an LMS and then can, get to their Khan Academy account or their ST Math account. The issue, though, is really on back-end integration, that the data coming out of discrete programs doesn't talk to each other. And so that idea of having a real-time sense of where each individual student is on his progression towards mastery is still quite far away in a lot of blended learning classrooms. And I would say that's the case even in non-competency-based classrooms, right? But that lack of real-time data, I think, is holding us back from really unleashing the potential of flexible pacing in a way that competency-based advocates have been calling for. I already talked a bit about the adaptive assignable piece. Yes, David, it's learning. I knew that you were using a different one because we talked about it and I forgot to add it. So yeah, I think this is just an important place to pay attention. And I think what my experience is that I have conversations, at least a handful of conversations every month where there's folks at the district level asking me who's on this list, what I've heard in terms of sort of reputation and sort of customer satisfaction. And my concern in those one-off conversations is like, why is there not a coherent way for these one-off conversations to be coming together and articulating what a really good system looks like? And so be attentive to that. I think statewide licensing is one really important bargaining chip as Michigan thinks about what a successful platform could look like. And you guys are obviously could be leaders in that conversation and really getting a cool platform play to the market. So I'll just end on this note that although I think that there's sort of a lot of different directions that the conversation is going right now, and I think that we sometimes oversimplify how blended learning can complement a competency-based system, my hope is that as we get really clear on what a successful competency-based model looks like, we'll be able to understand how blended learning can be a really valuable scale and differentiation tool in those environments. And I'll end on this. Which is like really cheesy. I just decided to end on an up note, but thinking about how long this conversation has been around and how technology can really help. So this is actually from a 1982 publication. Again, this is thinking about competency-based sort of having its roots in a curricular reform. But what you can see in this quote is that really where technology can be helpful is actually this media and materials question and how we can actually differentiate and deliver media and materials in new, innovative, and definitely more efficient ways. So I'll wrap up there. I wanted to leave time for questions. I know I talked a little bit fast. And again, Michael Horn will be sort of doing the roll up your sleeves and implement blended learning conversation beginning of November. So that should be helpful for those of you who are trying to get programs off the ground. Oh, I see a question. Can you talk a little bit about CBE and certification, i.e. badges, completion of learning pathways? Yeah, I think that, so thanks for the question, Jason. I think that the issue with badges, both in higher ed and K-12, has always been like, do they mean anything, right? And it's a chicken and egg question, because for them to mean something, there has to be something on the back end that acknowledges their meaning. In higher ed, it's sort of workforce, salience in the workforce. In K-12, it's probably institutions of higher ed recognizing competency-based badges as meaningful. And I think that's sort of why a lot of folks, particularly in the Northeast right now, are pushing for grading reform as the kind of fulcrum, right? I was talking about, I actually think assessment is probably the fulcrum from a pedagogy perspective. Grading reform is probably the fulcrum from making sure that there's continuity for students into career and college afterwards. The best example, I think, this is less of a badging reform, but stepping back one level from badging and thinking about that sort of, what does a competency-based badge / diploma mean going forward? The best example of that I've seen is here in the Northeast, a consortium of Northeastern colleges signing on to a letter that says, we will acknowledge and recognize competency-based diplomas that obviously look different from traditional report cards, and sort of actually putting a foot forward to say, we think this is a good thing for kids and we want students that hold these. I would think about that as a first play in a state like Michigan before you try and get really granular with each individual badge. I do think the last piece, though, to acknowledge that maybe more what's animating your question is, how are we motivating students within a competency-based system, right? And I think that's actually where software developers have had to answer that question more urgently than analog teachers have necessarily had to, because to sell their product, they have to show that it actually keeps kids' attention. So I think that certainly Khan Academy and some others have come up with interesting badging programs. Honestly, I'm sort of in wait and see on whether they actually are solving on that motivation question. So I guess that's an ambivalent answer at best. But I would, before I think about badging, I'd think about certification and sort of acknowledgement from higher ed and career that a competency-based sort of whole report card means something. That's helpful.
Julia, this
go
is
ahead.
Dave. Just the challenge of the software companies is something that we're dealing with pretty in depth with It's Learning, and we do a lot of work with them on the development around competency-based so that the software will allow us to track and monitor how students are doing in each of the content areas and meeting those competencies.
Yeah.
Do you see a larger national conversation coming around and understanding? Because I don't know that the software companies really understand what it is we're trying to quantify and show around mastery.
Right. Okay. So yeah. So that, I think they probably can comprehend what you're trying to do. I think there is not a huge market for what you're trying to do, right? So their sales teams are never going to organize around Fraser's competencies unless they think that you're like the model of the future, which many might. I mean, having met you, I'm sure many might, but that's like the bet they would have to make, right?
Right.
I think that the confusion right now, and you and I have talked about this before, is that what with the coming of Common Core, the main incentive structure and sort of demand that software companies are responding to right now is standards alignment. And then they're also all racing to align to SBAC and PARC, with that being a bet unto itself, right? And so there's not much room between being standards-based and additionally aligned to these new assessments to incorporate the idea of competency as a thing that's separate from standards. This is where I think people need to pool demand in much smarter ways than we've managed to. But it's where each individual school system sitting down and articulating unique competencies is never going to allow that to happen, right? I think New Hampshire having statewide competencies, you talk to educators in the state, they think the statewide competencies are like not great all the time. I've heard some like very inflammatory language, in fact, about the quality of those competencies. But what it did do is it meant that an institution like VLAX and external software providers actually had one thing to glom onto that they could design around. And I think that's the type of scale that's going to move a software vendor, whether it's statewide or a regional cluster or a cluster of school districts in different states. But I think as a one-off school, you can fight that fight and try and sell them on your model being the model of the future. But if they're not convinced of that, they're going to be spending resources on Common Core alignment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I just think about the tipping point when the competency-based model gains the traction on scale, and I know that's why I put in the chat. We just need some real examples of this and how it works.
Yep.
And then what's the tipping point? And I would love your national perspective, because I really think you're one of the most tuned in people in this conversation across the country. What's the tipping point to where you don't feel like you're an anomaly in this conversation?
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I mean, I liken it. I hesitate to do this because blended learning is a delivery model and not a wholesale new philosophy, right? So I've tried to nail them that I think these are different. But I do think that codifying models is like the next step that no one's really undertaken, right? Because until it's not like everyone has to reinvent the wheel every time they try and become a competency-based system, like this is going to be an incredibly incremental movement. And even in New Hampshire, again, partly because of this tradition of local control, which makes it, I mean, it is what it is. I just married a libertarian, so I can't really knock it. But the problem with that being the test bed for this is that there's a complete resistance to sort of codifying models, because the whole idea is that we're each a unique district unto ourselves. But what our blended learning work has done, I don't think that we've necessarily like changed the world as we know it, but we've codified models such that if you want to start a blended learning program, you don't start from scratch anymore. There's actually like a choreography out there for what it actually means. And then from there, we can evaluate quality. We're sort of trying to do both at once right now with competency-based, which is also making me nervous because it means that we're trying to evaluate the quality of a model we haven't even codified yet. I feel like that's a downer answer, but it's this model piece that I keep coming back to. And that also will clarify the software market, right? These one-off design projects, they're fine for your school systems that are really trying to chart this future forward, but those R&D funds are going to run out at software companies, right? It's not a sustainable solution. So I think that's a big part of it that's holding it back. And I do think Common Core alignment is where the resources are going right now, because that's what our accountability structure is focused on. The other thing I'd say, though, that I just sort of had the idea as you asked the question, like one question would be, are there areas that are we would call these areas of non-consumption, but are there electives or subject areas where software providers actually haven't spent a lot of time on Common Core alignment because there aren't standards or because they're not sort of tested subjects, but where you can do sort of really in-depth building out the competencies with a software provider and figure out the architecture, right? Because you're asking both a content and an architecture question. So in an area where right now there isn't a lot of pressure from the standards-based side, like are there subjects where you could do that and then that paves the way to doing it across core subjects as well? And I don't know what that would look like, but it might be an interesting, in your spare time as a software entrepreneur, might be an interesting place to play.
I think the higher ed pressure point that you mentioned, that external force, could drive that downward in a good way.
For sure.
So I think that the K-12 response, when they're seeing universities like Purdue and some of the others shifting entire programs over to a competency-based model, that's going to give a lot of street credibility to the configuration.
For sure.
But I love the thought of kind of codifying those models, just like you have with blended. I think that's worth a deep dive conversation.
Yeah, for sure. And the higher ed point, you know, again, I don't mean to be a downer, but I always like qualify everything I say because I work at a think tank. Our caution there, or our anxiety there, is that employers have never been good at articulating the exact competencies, right? Like, this isn't a new idea that employers should say exactly what they need and we should align our higher ed system as such, right? But that's always been a struggle. So what those competencies are in higher ed will inevitably trickle down to K-12, right? That's how our system works, because a good high school gets you into a good college, right? So we'll define high school but by what colleges are doing. But the real question we need to all be paying attention to, just as like citizens right now, is how are employers defining those competencies, and are they reliable, and do they actually pan out for students? So that's like the question mark, I think, in the higher ed conversation. I think I agree with you 100% that structurally the shift is already well underway and is probably going to be pushing K-12 to pay way more attention than you and me talking about getting rid of seat time.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm seeing this other question. I'm also keeping an eye on time, Marcia. Sorry, I'll just do this last question. As community support is generated, describe competencies to a parent. Yeah, this is where this Northeast like consortium letter, and I can send the link to Marcia and she can somehow get it out to you guys. The model in the Northeast was a very deliberate process of getting over 50 colleges to like sit at the table and say, we 100% are on board with this new type of grading and we will accept these transcripts. You know, I think that it sounds very concrete and sort of simplistic, but I think that's the kind of organizing that has to happen before you can have an honest conversation with a parent and say, yes, this will have little to no impact and may even help your child's chances, right? So let me get that sort of document and effort from the Northeast to Marcia, and she can let you know, Troy. I guess that's it, Marcia. Do I need to somehow hand this back to you, or?
I was on mute.
Oh.
I was talking to you. Sorry. If you could, that's so funny how you think you're talking and nobody can hear you. I wanted to point out that there was another question above Troy's from Jan Birmingham, which may have gotten covered up. If you don't mind scrolling back up, either that or I can just
in a virtual room.
Grab it for you.
Site. Sure. So I think that I think we would call that a full-time virtual program, but maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, Jan. Do you mean?
Jan, do you want to? I just wondered if Jan might want to unmute herself. Do you want to ask the question, Jan? Oh, she said that is right, full-time virtual.
Yeah, and so that's, I mean, I think one thing I didn't mention, because Michael will probably mention it, so it's a bit redundant, is when you look at that chart of online learning growing at sort of this incredible rate, what that could mean is that full-time virtual is exploding. The fact of the matter is that that's not occurring because we still want the custodial social community experience of a brick and mortar school. So the rapid growth of online learning is less in full-time virtual settings and more in blended brick and mortar plus some online settings. And even I mentioned that enriched virtual model, that's sort of where we're seeing a lot of the virtual providers go. So they may have been able to successfully expand access to students who otherwise couldn't make it to a brick and mortar location, but they're increasingly seeing that to really be effective, they need a face-to-face sort of support center, even if it's not traditional instruction happening in those buildings. So that's just something to point out. But
good. Thank you. Are there any other questions from anybody? Julia, this has been fascinating, and I'm always glad that there is a recording, because it's always nice to go back and revisit and relearn and hear the parts that, you know, sometimes you're listening and your brain, you get so ignited that your brain goes off in a direction and you have to bring yourself back. You gave a lot of such important information. I really appreciate that. You mentioned sending me some documents, and I wondered if we could also if you could share your PowerPoint with us, and if we could put those up along with the recording on the website. Okay.
Great.
And then so we can wrap things up. Julia, you're going to want to stop the recording, and then actually I wonder if I can do that. Let me just see if I can do that right now. We can also stay on the second. Nope, I can't. So you're going to have to stop that, please. And then if you and I can chat about how we can get that back over here to me. But thank you all for attending. Any questions that you have, please let us know. Julia has her contact information there. Again, I want to make sure that I thank our sponsors because they have been wonderful to support these efforts. So we've got Michigan Virtual, My Virtual Academy, ThinkSpace, and of course EdTech Specialists. So thank you all, and I'll look forward to the next one on October 20th and November 3rd with Michael Horn. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Marcia.
Thank you.
Great job. Thank you.
Marcia?
Yeah. Yep.
I can't figure out how to stop recording.
You should just be able to hit the record button again.
So for some reason that disappeared. This is like a spoof of EdTech where it's like you can't get the technology to work. Let's see. So am I still an organizer? Is that the issue?
Yes. Yeah, you are. So on your control panel, it doesn't have